just like our next guest, John McMullen, our 97.3 ESPN Eagles insider. In my hand, John, I hold the official bird's eye view, because God forbid you don't have all the facts that are Eagles approved, including the playoffs. Philadelphia owns the third best home winning percentage. Thanks for playing, right? I mean, I want to know from you the Saturday Twitter question and your answer to that, because I'm asking our listeners about Eagles Cowboys, and my question is this: in your lifetime, I'm not talking media lifetime, Johnny Mac, which Cowboys versus Eagles game stands out to you and why?
Well, I'm old, Pete, so
am I.
The NFC Championship game, I think, is a pretty easy one. Wilbert Montgomery. And I think about, remember how dominant the Cowboys were back then. I mean, that's sort of where America's team started. So that was the team. And there were a lot of dynasties in that era of football because that was pre-free agency. So when you got a good group together, you had them for a decade or so, and you sort of dominated. That's what the Cowboys did. And the Eagles were finally able to beat them. So, and people should take a look at that, go to Pro Football Reference and look at the box score or something and see as Ron Jaworski and Danny White, who were the quarterbacks, and see their numbers and see how the game has changed over the years. You were allowed to play defense back then.
Yeah, you were allowed to hit somebody. I mean, the secondary's job to try and slow down the receiver was maybe a little arm shot to the chest area. I mean, it pretty much anything went, and people were mentioning Pickle Juice game, John. A lot of people mentioned the 4th and 1. They did it again. T.O. was mentioned when he played for the Cowboys, and the Eagles were able to go down and beat him. But that game, now I was there, John, at that game in 1981. I was about to turn 10, and I got frostbite on my feet.
It was worth it, though, I assume, as an Eagles fan.
Sure, until, the Raiders and, what was it, Tom Flores and, Jim Plunkett and all those guys went down and partied on Bourbon Street and were in 2019 or 2020 version, it would be Netflix and chill. They were totally relaxed. And poor Dick Vermeil had the Eagles so tightly wound up and following every regimented rule that they didn't show up. I remember that Super Bowl very, very well, and the Eagles, unfortunately, did not show up against the Raiders.
Well, it's still pretty good. I always say it amazes me, and I think that's more of a modern thing than back then. But people always, now it's, and maybe it's the Sixers more than anything in this town, the whole tanking philosophy, championship or bust. It's pretty impressive to go to the Super Bowl. Obviously, in the moment, you're very disappointed, but especially for an organization, again, I think younger people understand the Eagles weren't exactly what they are today. Jeffrey Lurie has turned this into one of the best organizations in the NFL. That wasn't the case back then. So the fact that Dick Vermeil was able to turn that thing around and get that team to that point, it's one of the most impressive things in Eagles history, to be honest.
Yeah, I saw a line earlier when we were talking about the rivalry, and I want to get the dates exactly correct. From 1962 to 1977, the Eagles had one winning season. The Cowboys, meanwhile, had 9 division titles, 4 NFC championships, and 2 Super Bowl titles during that same time. The Cowboys won 11 straight games over the Eagles from 1967 to 72.
I kind of brought that up after the Dolphins game because I had this flood of people that are saying, this was the most embarrassing moment in Eagles history. I'm like, you're talking about a team that won 2 decades without making the playoffs at one point. And you're talking about admittedly a bad loss, but they've been around since, that new era is doing that caps thing. And if you see around on the NFL sidelines, there's a year on people's caps. 1933 for the Eagles. That's when it all started. This organization has been around for a long time. And as I said before, there's a whole generation of fans who don't realize that this you've been spoiled a bit by this organization. It wasn't always like this.
100%. Yeah, 1933. It's 1933 they started, the same year as the Pittsburgh Pirates that were then renamed the Steelers, and the defunct Cincinnati Reds, which became the St. Louis Gunners before ceasing operation. But, yeah, Steve Van Buren, Pete Pihos, right, 1947 championship game, 59 they were geared up, won the championship in 60, Norm Van Brocklin, Tommy McDonald, Chuck Bednarik, right, Pete Retzlaff, I can go on and on. But then the Cowboys, like they were the expansion team, right? I mean, they weren't they weren't around as long as the Eagles.
No, not even close. But and as you said, if you think of the quarterbacks, Terry Bradshaw with the 4 Super Bowls. The Pittsburgh Steelers were number one in that era from a success standpoint. The Cowboys became sort of the NFC team, but there was also the Bud Grant Vikings, the Chuck Knox Rams, the Raiders, Ken Stabler, John Madden, and then Tom Flores, the Dolphins with Don Shula. Those were the heavyweights, and those were the teams that were in it every single year for a decade. And it was harder because there wasn't 35% roster turnover every year. You got these Hall of Famers, and the NFL's doing their top 100 all time for the 100th anniversary. You see some of these Hall of Famers getting honored. They were there. I mean, it wasn't free agency and you had to worry about switching teams. They were there. So you got them, and it was tough to deal with them.
John McMullen's with us here on the Pete Thompson Show on 97.3 ESPN. He's our 97.3 ESPN Eagles Insider. He's on Twitter at JF McMullen, and he's well qualified to talk about what's going to take place at Lincoln Financial Field tomorrow at 4:25, and that is another chapter of Eagles-Cowboys rivalry with meaning. There is plenty on the line, and I opened the show, John, by talking a little bit about the fact that Lane Johnson ruled out for the game, high ankle sprain. 4 other starters are questionable. 2 on defense, Derek Barnett and Avonte Maddox. 2 on offense, Nelson Aguilar, Jordan Howard. What jumps out at you about the latest Doug update, I guess, yesterday, and who might go and who might not?
Well, I think if you're hoping for anyone to go, you should focus on Derek Barnett. Everybody else, we talked about Jordan Howard for weeks and weeks and weeks now. I mean, he's been questionable. He's been limited for 6 weeks, and he's not cleared for contact. So, I think you sort of look at that versus how the Dallas Cowboys handled Dak Prescott, and they were above board about it, said pretty much from the beginning of the week he's not going to practice, but he's going to play. And they put out their final injury report, and he's not even on it because he is going to play and he is going to start. And the Eagles have been playing these games with Jordan Howard specifically, but also Nelson Aguilar. And they're not really questionable. So, I think the NFL, they did it with Matthew Stafford, the Detroit Lions. They fined him for not being above board with the injury report. I think the Eagles might want to be a little bit more honest to me. Or get ready to pull out the checkbook.
This isn't the first time we've been talking about this, John, and how the Eagles are dealing with injuries and there's sort of slow reveal or confusion on what the injury actually is.
Yeah, I've talked about a lot with Mike on the Sports Bash, and a lot of people, because there's this narrative. And I think it's an uneducated one that criticizes the Eagles medical staff. This is not an Eagles medical staff problem. This is an Eagles messaging problem. And it comes from the football side. It comes from whatever you want to call it, competitive advantage, not being honest. It's not like the medical staff is going, oh, what does he have? Does he have? They're not, and they come across, and I've told this to the Eagles behind the scenes. You make your medical staff come across poorly. You make players come across poorly. I think the best example of that was Darren Sproles last season, who was out for what was it, 10 weeks with
right.
what they described as a hamstring strain. So you heard all these fans saying, they don't get to see Darren Sproles. If you went around the Eagles locker room and said, who's the hardest worker? Who works the hardest on his fitness in the weight room and all that? Darren Sproles is legendary. In the NFL, forget about the Eagles for his workout regimen. Nobody's working harder than that guy. But that's something, and they start to question, he can't come back from hamstring strain in 10 weeks? Well, he finally did come back, and he admitted he was dealing with far more than that. So my point being, Pete, the Eagles make not only their medical staff look bad, but they make the player look bad by being dishonest in these types of situations. This year, it's Nelson Aguilar. Everyone's like, he's making a business decision. I've been asked this question on this radio station numerous times. Guy's got a grapefruit-sized swelling on his left knee.
Right.
He's not lying.
Yeah.
He's hurt.
That was Doug's most fiery yesterday, right? As somebody said, he's struggling with the swelling in his knee, and Doug shoots back, have you seen him? Oh, well, yeah. You guys see him.
Yeah, well, that's the point. We all saw him in the locker room. We're going, what the hell? He's got a growth coming out of his left knee, and this team has not been honest about the injuries, tried to play through it. He hurt it way back in October against Minnesota. That's how long it's been. Tried to play through it, was ineffective, obviously took hits from that standpoint. Now, by no means am I trying to say Nelson is a great player, because he's obviously not. We've seen a large sample size. But you've heard it, Pete. You said, I'm sure you've heard people question whether he's really hurt, whether he's trying to fight through it.
Sure.
Well, he's really hurt. I can tell you that 100%.
Talking to John McMullen, our 97.3 ESPN Eagles Insiders. It's Eagles-Cowboys tomorrow. I thought there was a line of questioning yesterday about, Eagles-Cowboys during Doug's time here that perked my ears up, and not one but two questions of trying to get Doug to sort of reveal something about his time here. And Doug's Doug, right? He's not going to – he's better than Andy. He's not going to say we look forward to the challenge of playing the Cowboys. That's about the only line he'll say over and over again. But what did you get out of that conversation yesterday?
Well, a couple things. It has been slow starts, and it has been turnovers for the main part. And if you think about it and what the Cowboys are and where they start offensively, it is with Ezekiel Elliott, and it is with the running game. It's difficult to stick with the running game when you're losing by 2 touchdowns. It's very easy to stick with the running game when you're winning by 2 touchdowns. And the Eagles have gotten off the bad start, turned over the football, short fields, especially earlier this season, letting the Cowboys offense go 20, 30 yards for a touchdown. And all of a sudden you're behind the 8 ball and the snowball starts heading down the wrong side of the hill. But it's also a tough matchup just from a style standpoint for the Eagles, because they have a lot of playmakers. And it's easy to say load the box against Ezekiel Elliott, but if you do that, then you have corners trying to match up with Amari Cooper and Michael Gallup and Randall Cobb. So I joked, what's the game plan? Cross your fingers and hope Dak Prescott can't get the ball down the field with his shoulder.
Right. Yeah, that's there's some validity to that when the Dak Prescott shoulder injury news came out. But I'm not around the team like you are, but when I watched the Cowboys and how they played against the Rams, and I saw how the Eagles had played against the Redskins, and people the next day said, well, what do you think? I said, I'll tell you what I think. There's no way the Eagles beat that Cowboys team. If that Cowboys team shows up, it ain't happening. But you mentioned the word style there a minute ago, John McMullen, and I just started chuckling like, what's he reading my mind? That was going to be my next thing. Styles make fights. Is it that type of thing? The literal question that you asked Doug Peterson yesterday, and his answer was what?
Well, he kind of explained what's going on. So, from his standpoint, he can't just say, yeah, this is a terrible matchup for us. And understandably so. but in a lot of ways, I think it is. I mean, they haven't been able to beat the Cowboys when Zeke has been on the field. The only two times they beat him is when he was out. So it starts there, and they all know that, and they all know they have to stop the run game first, which is easier said than done, first and foremost. But secondly, that makes things easier when it comes to play action, when it comes to RPOs. But that's where Dak's injury, and Dak's injury is real. I have heard people say the Cowboys are trying to fool. I don't know. I've heard they're trying to fool the Eagles. I've heard they're building up an excuse in case they lose. You know, Occam's razor, Pete. Sometimes the simplest answer is the real answer. He's hurt, and he got hurt early against the Rams. He didn't throw the football at all in the second half because he couldn't throw the football, and he's got significant swelling in his shoulder. And it comes down to whether it's an AC joint, that's what the Cowboys are saying, or if it's a rotator cuff contusion. If it's the latter, there's going to be significant swelling, and there's going to be very difficult. It's going to be very difficult for him to throw the football like he typically does. And if that's the case, the Eagles are helped out mightily. And by the way, I think that's the case because that's what happens. That's the injury when you get swelling. And that's why he hasn't been able to throw the football in practice. Threw it a little bit on Friday, but not much. It's because there's swelling in his shoulder. It's a significant injury.
John, listen, I'll be the first one to tell you I definitely agree with you that this is a bad matchup for the Eagles. But when I look at the body of work of Eagles versus Cowboys since Carson Wentz and Dak Prescott have been the starting quarterbacks, you look in 2016, the first game, everybody should argue that the Eagles should have won. That was the overtime game, if people remember. The second game, the Eagles won, albeit Dallas was resting its starters. So, you know, that you throw that one out the window. In 2017, yes, they won. The Eagles won the first game, and Zeke didn't play. But that team was playing so well enough, you can argue if Zeke plays, they still beat them. And then Dallas got a win at the end of the season, obviously, when the Eagles were resting their starters. And we all know the story about last year's game in Dallas where Carson's last start, where all the bad calls, et cetera, et cetera. And then, you know, they lay an egg this year. I'm just saying that when you look at the numbers, Dak has thrown, 9 TDs and 8 picks in those games, while Wentz, when he's played, has thrown 11 TDs and 2 picks. Is it more of the Eagles just need to close the deal? Because I feel like that it's not every game that they're playing bad. And I just gave you the background story of the whole Dak versus Wentz Eagles-Cowboys matchup story.
No, yeah, I mean, the context, you're right. I mean, you had the back-to-back seasons where each team was resting starters in each Sudfeld game. Who cares? So when you break it down to each individual game, it really comes down to the last 2 seasons where the Cowboys have been able to do some things. And obviously they blew them out significantly earlier this season. But it's not Carson versus Dak. I mean, Carson's a better quarterback than Dak Prescott. Doesn't mean Dak Prescott's a bad quarterback. He's a very good quarterback. It has to do with weaponry. And I've talked about it a lot. Look what the Cowboys are rolling out. Ezekiel Elliott. Eagles have Miles Sanders. You might like him. He's not Ezekiel Elliott. Amari Cooper, Michael Gallup, Randall Cobb versus J.J. Arcega-Whiteside, Greg Ward, and Rob Davis. Who would you prefer? I mean, it's not close. And then when you look at the defensive side of football, Cowboys have had a ton of issues defensively, but there is some talent there, DeMarcus Lawrence, and that's the reason Lane Johnson isn't playing. The Eagles don't want to roll him out there at whatever superficial number you want to throw out there, 80%, 85%, because they know how good DeMarcus Lawrence is, and they don't want him to look terrible against a player of that caliber. So you talk about Jalen Smith, you talk about even though they've struggled on the back end, there's some talent from an athletic standpoint, or you look at the Eagles' back seven and the corners and how bad they've been. It's been a common theme starting week 1 with Terry McLaurin, bookended with Terry McLaurin, in between Stephon Diggs, Devontae Parker, Darius Slayton. Well, arguably Amari Cooper's better than every single one of them. The linebackers, Nate Gary's your He's entrenched in your starting linebacker. Let me emphasize that again. Nate Gerry is entrenched as a starting linebacker. And, people have killed Doug Peterson and Jim Schwartz all year. This might be their best coaching job since they've been here.
Yeah, because you look at the talent, unbelievable. So true, John. John McMullen's on with us talking Eagles-Cowboys, that game tomorrow. You can hear it right here on 97.3 ESPN. Going to be epic or going to be ugly? One of those two choices will fit. Of course, you can answer that maybe on every game. You mentioned Lane Johnson a minute ago, and I wanted to ask you to chat in a couple weeks. How much, when Lane is in versus out, does that affect Brandon Brooks?
Pretty significant, obviously, when he had his anxiety attack, was tied to two things. He just signed his big money extension, and he puts too much pressure on himself, and Lane was out that week, and that's his best friend, not only on the field, but off the field. But he's calmed it down, and I think more of it had to do with the contract issue. And he's, it's not like Brandon is an all-pro guard because of Lane Johnson. On his own right, he's that good. So I don't think from a football standpoint it affects him that dramatically. And, oh, by the way, Halapoulivaati Vaitai played very well against the Redskins. There's another guy who's vilified, but for his job as a swing tackle, backup tackle in the NFL, he's one of the best in football. And that's why the Eagles feel comfortable letting Lane rest and get fully healthy rather than throwing him out there against great players. So that's kind of how that shook out. But Brandon's been the best right guard in football this year. And the only issue that derailed him was that anxiety attack. And that had more to do with the contract than anything else.
So, John, a couple of games now back-to-back where we've had fourth quarter/overtime Carson Wentz. Will we be able to get first quarter Carson Wentz? What's taking him so long to heat up?
Yeah, well, the Eagles knew that. I mean, that's been like a 2-year narrative. They've had a lot of difficulties trying to start games quickly, and that Doug mentioned it again yesterday, and they have to do that against the Cowboys. One of the issues recently has been getting behind early in games. So they started up-tempo last week. It worked a little bit. So maybe go back to that because I think it makes Carson feel comfortable. I've always said there's a little Brett Favre in Carson early in games, and if you remember Brett Favre at his apex, would always get very, very hyped up. It was a little inaccurate early in games. Then he would settle down and kill you. There's a lot of that to Carson Wentz. And you hope he can figure out how to hit the ground running early in games a little bit more quickly because that'll make things much easier for you.
If Jordan Howard is able to play, do they have any trouble fitting him in?
No, well, I don't think he's going to play. But when he does come back, I do think Miles Sanders has kind of earned his spot back and would be the lead back. And the second part is, remember, whenever he is cleared, and behind the scenes I've heard 4 to 6 weeks. This is week number 6. So who knows? Maybe the doctors wake up today and say, Jordan, you're cleared. But remember, if they do that, he hasn't been cleared for contact for 6 weeks. So I don't think he'd be ready to go back into his pre-injury mode anyway. At the end of that, he was getting 20, 25 touches a game. So in a lot of ways, that takes care of itself. You mix him back in, maybe 10 touches, and that will affect Boston Scott more than it will Miles Sanders. And I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing right now because the Eagles' offense is predicated on screens. That's what it is. Right. Screen, 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 screen. And, oh, by the way, 50 more screens. and to get that done, you need Miles or Boston on the field more than Jordan Howard, I would think.
He's our 97.3 Eagles insider, John McMullen. Did you give a prediction yet, or will you reveal it now?
I did, but I'll give it to you again. I said it's going to go one of two ways. Cowboys are either going to absolutely blow the Eagles off the field, or the Cowboys are going to do what the Cowboys do in close games and lose a close game, find a way to lose it. Dak is not healthy. It's going to be the latter. The Eagles are going to win 24-20.
All right, that sounds good to me. From your lips to God's ears, John McMullen, our 97.3 ESPN Eagles insider. Next 2 weeks, John, it's Ryan Rothstein and Hunter, so I'll let you work out the details with them. I'll be on my Flyers road trip, buddy, so Merry Christmas to you and your family, and I just thank you so much each time you come on the program here.
All right, Merry Christmas to you guys as well. Enjoyed it. Always do, Pete.
All right, take care. John McMullen, our 97.3 ESPN Eagles insider. Read his work on our website, 97.3 ESPN, and find him on Twitter. He's a must-follow on Twitter, @JF McMullen.